Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this summer edition of the 1 Hour with Europe appointment. This is the last one before going on holidays, and today we have the privilege and the honor to have with us the President of the Board of the European Innovation Council, Michael Scheffer. Michel Scheffer.
No, Michael.
Michael.
No, but Michiel.
You know, I'm always terrible with names that are not Italian.
It's like Michele.
Okay, Michele. So we have Michele Scheffer with us today. I am Massimo Busuoli. I am the director of the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, liaison office in Brussels. And we will be with you for the next hour. Before starting, a couple of reminders for who is following us for the first time. You will have the possibility to interact with our guest after the initial opening speech and introductory scene setter. And to interact with the speaker, you don't have to write the questions on the chat. I'm not going to read any questions. You have just to reserve your right to attend by writing your name in the chat. And I will call you to open your camera and microphone to intervene. So this is the way we are going to work. Michael, again, thank you very much. Welcome to our 1 Hour with Europe. We are very, very, very curious to know what is going to be the perspective of the European Innovation Council, this very important instrument for the innovation in Europe. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. To be precise, my function is president of the board of the European Innovation Council, which in Dutch, which is my nationality, is a pleonasm because a council is a council, or board is a council. So to be precise, our role is to, one of our main legal role under FP9, but FP10, if adopted as well, is to advise the Commission on developing the EIC, and then the EIC as a funding instrument and an ecosystem builder. My second role is that, besides chairing a board of 21 members, is to be an ambassador of the EIC. So basically, I was in Zagreb yesterday, I was in Ljubljana on Monday, I was in Bologna on Friday, I was in Berlin on Thursday. So basically, I do a lot of, let's say, also going around in Europe and understanding the field, and also, picking up, like today, picking up ideas that we can take into account in our advising.
I noticed that we have a technical issue with the sound. Check. Sorry to interrupt you. We need to make sure that the right setup is settled. Yeah, we continue. Okay. Probably you need to speak a little bit louder because the microphone is on the ceiling. Yeah.
Okay. Well, if we look at the future of the EIC, an important element to start with is that in any proposal, the EIC has a future. And I just went this morning to the opening of the annual budget conference of the European Commission, and Piotr Serafin was not literally quoting the EIC, but he was saying that in the next MFF, an important element would be to look at instruments with a high leverage, and he was mentioning the leverage of funding innovative startups, where basically besides the European budget, often national promotional banks participate, and also, of course, private investors participate. So that's also an important element of the future. Let's say the EIC also as a, let's say, financial experiment of, let's say, of having another approach to public funding than the classic granting one. And it's important to mention this, that there's a future for the EIC because it's a new kid on the block. It was created in 2021, operational, the design between 2017 and 2019. And the start of the EIC was not bright. That had a lot of children diseases, and also with what you always have with this kind of financial instrument, where you have a blend of grant and equity, always, let's say, an ideological debate whether government should do that at all, the market should do that, or another line, government should use grants and should not do into investments. That's a different place. So the EIC had a debatable start, and by now it is seen as an adult instrument and as an instrument that will be expanded in the next period. So it's important to stress that it was not natural, I would say, 3 years ago that the EIC would become a success. It has become a success. It's also important to say why it has become a success. I think, and I have nothing to do with that, it was well designed. So basically, the team that worked with Carlos Moedas on designing the EIC, and people like Jean-David Malo, Keith Sekira, have really imagined an intelligent system, and they have also learned well from member states that had already parts of it. So in France, in the Netherlands, in Germany, in a number of Scandinavian countries, there were elements that were able to learn from and to integrate in the system. That's one thing. The second thing, which is important as well, that's also a compliment to Jean-David Malo, the agency has been quite interested in learning from to improve, and that's a very important feature. And as always the case with governments, the ability to adjust the system to the learnings. So a system that started with 2 instruments, Pathfinder and Accelerator, by now has 6 instruments. Pathfinder, Transition, the pre-accelerator for widening countries, the accelerator, let's say a kind of post-accelerator as STEP, and the recently announced Scale-Up Fund, which is a blended fund of European funding with private funding. What is also important to keep in mind, also for the future of the IC, that data architecture is very likely to remain the same. And that's also important in innovation policies. So while innovation policies has to, let's say, invite innovation, it works best if the instruments are stable. So governments that change every year their instruments create basically a closed shop because only the insiders know how it changes. While if you have a reliable instrument that enables SMEs to say, okay, I'm too early, I'm due next year, knowing that next year there will be a call as well. So the instrument will remain roughly the same. However, the board has advised, and also the commission has taken up, a number of changes. And I would also say the landscape is different than 7 years ago. So if you look at all the, let's say, if you look at the initial PowerPoints that often I use when I present the EIC, if you look at the original text of the EIC, was very much about closing the valley of death. That was it. And so Europe is good in research, it is good in innovation and patents, and then basically it goes into a valley of death, and almost no one survives that. And so it was designed with a Pathfinder and to improve the transition from research to patents. And so Pathfinder ends with a patent portfolio, then transition, move out the company out of the university context, develop a business plan, finalize further technological challenges, then the accelerator really to cover the valley of death itself and basically enable the company to get to, let's say, a revenue stream. And then we discovered that basically companies were dying with more money lost, and we created STEP. And so basically to get to let's say a break-even point. And now the scale up is basically added to really get out of the valley of death and going to a profitable situation. So the valley of death was a key concept 7 years ago. I think by now strategic autonomy is the main topic. A topic that was somehow indirectly quoted when FP9 was designed, but in FP10, strategic autonomy is really an important theme. I would say also to all the listeners and all the comments, what strategic autonomy really is still to be better defined. It's a bit, let's say, vaguely defined. So one of the things that the board will do as well in preparing for a next work program is going a bit more in depth into the different themes and give advice on, well, what is strategic autonomy when it comes to semiconductors, photonics, AI, for example? What is strategic autonomy when it comes to health, when it comes to energy, to materials, to food? So that basically we have a better view, either as a guideline for the work programs or as a guideline for evaluations to have a better feeling on that. So that's an important element, which is also important, of course, in strategic autonomy is, and I'm saying this because I have a Norwegian host, which is not, Norway is not yet part of the EU, is that the strategic autonomy is, of course, defined as the 27 plus. And in circles, I would say Norway is the first one in the circles because it's an active member of the system and it's a NATO member. So that is really a first position. Switzerland is very active in R&D, but is not a NATO member. UK is also a NATO member, but is, let's say, has a heritage. And then if you go further, Iceland is small. a nice country, but the potential is different than the Norwegian one, and Israel is the fifth one. Yeah, also has an interesting situation. So strategic autonomy should be defined as an open strategic autonomy that also takes around, let's say, the countries around us. So that's an important change. A second important change is that, and that's often also an important element in debates. So I was in Croatia and Slovenia earlier this week. We still have two, let's say, segments. One segment is really the startup segment, and that's really focused on how does a company emerges out of a university, and with things like scientists cannot entrepreneur enterprise. Well, that's not entirely true. But so there's a whole focus on early stage issues. And since we have companies that have gone through the valley of death and are here, now we suddenly have scaling up issues, where the question is, do we get a fusion power plant? The fusion power plant, a pilot one costs 150 to 1 million euros. How do we get into the modernization of the automotive industry? How is agriculture going to change from, let's say, an animal-oriented sector to a more vegetable-oriented section? So we get now a whole range of scale-up ecosystem questions where demand is an important element, and let's say private demand. So let's say sectors like agriculture or large corporations like Airbus or ASML or Mistral by now. Is it public procurement also becomes a question. So we have a whole range of issues that come up that has to do with scaling up. And the first example of what the board did 2 weeks ago, we issued a statement on energy. Because we have a substantial portfolio of energy companies in the EIC, and they can only develop further if airplane companies take up more sustainable airplane fuels. If indeed there's a vision on fusion technology, if indeed, let's say batteries as a regulation technology is more used in the energy systems in Europe. So we have a whole range of issues for this energy cluster where we have said, well, we have to look, the Commission and the Member States have to look more at creating an ecosystem that is, let's say, inclined to buy the stuff that our companies generate. So that's an important change. In the same time, let's be clear, there is a clear focus of scale-ups in a limited number of countries. And so you see that 3 countries in STEP, for example, are really dominant. And so France, Germany, Netherlands, I think, are around 50% of the STEP proposals, while in the accelerator it is about 40%, which is also substantial. While on the other hand, there's a whole range of countries in Europe that have not yet any STEP beneficiaries. So they are still in the startup stage. Or even, let's take Croatia. I had breakfast with all the Croatian beneficiaries. We fit on this table in Croatia. While in the city where my wife is a professor, in that city, even the beneficiaries do not fit on this table.
Okay.
Yeah, that city has 170,000 inhabitants, and Croatia has 5 million. So there's still an imbalance. So a part of Europe is still in the development of a startup environment, which means promoting that universities have a policy for startups, promoting that a VC scene develops, and the venture capital is in a lot of countries poorly developed. That's certainly the case in the countries I was earlier this week, but also Croatia. And so besides Croatia, Slovenia, also countries like Portugal or Greece have a relatively shallow, undeep, narrow VC landscape. So that's also, let's say, important to have in mind as a background. And finally, what is also interesting is that that's the human side of it, is that we are also really developing an ecosystem. So whether I go in Croatia or last week in Berlin, you see increasingly people that are in the same system and meet each other. And so by having a funding instrument, by having a number of ecosystem measures, there's now a vibrant landscape of startup conferences in Europe, and you see people that meet each other again. And that is also an important part of innovation. One, it is that it creates a class of people that have an interest in the startup and the scale-up landscape, but it also creates events where people meet each other. So it is creating, let's say, a single market for startups, which also means that you see VCs investing more across borders. And for example, again, I would use the example this week in in Slovenia and Croatia, I mean, they will have to look at VCs based in München or in Vienna to scale up. And so we see that's a cross-regional clustering happening. So this is basically important for the context of where we move to into the FP10. And so just to summarize, two main things. One is really the scaling up environments, which is important to look at. And still there is, let's say, a widening issue of how to help the lagging regions to improve, to perform better in the EIC. The lagging regions are not only the widening countries. And even some widening countries, like Estonia, do quite well. But let's take on the other side that we don't have any project funded in the accelerator south of Ascoli Piceno in Italy. Nothing in southern Italy. Nothing. Niente. And the same thing is in France. I was recently in the center of France, and we have hardly any projects between Orléans and Tours. So still, let's say, still there is a gap within countries. And of course, 97% of the beneficiaries of the EIC are in university cities. And so that creates a strong connection. So the widening, or let's say the regional imbalance, is still something to look at. What is also important for, let's say, the next budget is that I use the metaphor of the icing on the cake, or la cerise sur le gâteau in French. So basically, the EIC builds well on well-developed regional ecosystems. And that's partly because, well, some regions have that already for long. I found recently a note of the former governor of Brabant, the southern province of the Netherlands, and in his memoirs, he died 2 years ago, but in the memoirs, he refers to the first 25 million guilders that he made available for the Regional Development Agency to fund startups in 1985. And so the start of, let's say, policies for startups in the UK, mainly in the Netherlands, was mid-1980s. And as a response to the industrial crisis of the 80s, and the decline of textiles, shoes, steel, shipbuilding, created that. So basically, some countries already started 40 years ago, others more recently, and you'll see also those who are starting more recently have a much faster build up. And so in Croatia, I won't use that example more often. And so they really realize that we have to do something with startups, and they only realized that 2 years ago. But the speed they had in 2 years is impressive compared to the Netherlands in 40 years' time. But the icing on the cake is an important one, and also use always my own city and the region where I was a regional minister. In my city, we have 9 beneficiaries out of about 100 companies supported by the provincial funds. 10%. Yeah, 10% in a well-performing region. So basically, the EIC works when there is a good layer of seed funding and ecosystem building at local, regional, and national level. You can't improvise yourself into the EIC, and if a country is going to measure its economic success or the success of its policy based on the EIC beneficiaries, yeah, I mean, to have 5 beneficiaries for a country will not change the regional economy. Unless it's a proof that below that you have 50 companies that are not funded by the EIC, but basically create an ecosystem. And so the icing on the cake is important. That also means that we as an EIC board will also give an advice after the summer on how to better design from the start on ERDF programs so that they provide a pathway towards the EIC. Let's look at some more complicated issues. One of the uncertainties, of course, is the budget. So we have the catalogue is now known. So basically, the Commission has proposed a budget of around 34 billion euros for 7 years. That was a proposal that we, as a board, received with moderate enthusiasm, but enthusiasm. So basically, yeah, with that kind of budget, you get a decent share of what Draghi thinks was needed. Draghi talks about 800 billion euros needed to revamp the European economy, 34 billion. If you take an average effect of 3 years, so that for each euro, 3 euros of private money comes in, you get to 100 billion budget, let's say leveraged budget. So that's a reasonable impact. The Parliament has been so kind as to propose an EIC budget of 48 billion euros. That's something we have to think about how to implement that. The Cypriotic presidency came some weeks ago with a budget of 32 billion, so it's a small haircut compared to
But not terrible, I would say.
It's not terrible, and I'm a bit concerned by the frugal countries that overall want to cut off the overall budget of 25%. And if that would be the cut in the EIC budget, that has consequences. So that's one thing, and let's look at the consequences. What we have been very strongly advocating is to have a more APA approach to the EIC. I don't like the word APA because it's an American concept, and of course, what will come out, whether it's our proposal, what the Commission will do with it, or what the member states will change in it, it is not going to be ARPA in a strict sense, but it is a more programmatic strategic approach. And also it is, let's say, a more portfolio approach. So looking at, let's say, what are the gaps, what is needed. It is also, let's say, having a better connection to competitiveness. So then the EIC ECF connection is an important one. I will come back on that. And what is also important in an APA approach is to give more autonomy or speed to the program management of, let's say, increasing a grant of the beneficiary, making the transition from one grant to the other one faster. That's something we call the fast lane, and which in the legislation is seen as the possibility of doing funding without calls, and especially transition, which is, let's say, which will be formalized in the next program. The transition instrument could be a more flexible instrument that you can apply for basically when you're finalizing your Pathfinder project. And so doing Pathfinder without calls, it doesn't make much sense that it's useful, but basically to transit from one instrument to the other should be easier. So instead of writing a new proposal, you basically write, well, an adapted impact paragraph and basically 2 or 3 new work packages. And also the procedure of evaluation should be lighter, and also the awarding procedure should be lighter. What is also part of an APA approach is to remove a number of procedures. And so by now the award decision of funding has to be taken by the Council of Commissioners. That basically extends the procedure of awarding by several weeks. And basically even then, the program committee, all the member states have to see also what's going to be awarded. They have never changed anything. So whether they get informed formally in advance or they get information afterwards, practically doesn't make a difference. Because they could also say, well, we're not very happy with what you've done, so please next time look at this, could also have an impact. So that is a bit of a price to pay if you want to have a more flexible, agile system. Yeah, you have to remove a number of procedures. So that's an important component as well. What is also important is the idea of transition. The transition is to be much more kind of rotonde. So you have different entries into it. So you can enter now only if you have let's say, a preceding European project, an ERC proof of concept initially, ERC grants, other Horizon grants. Our idea would also be to promote, if the budget is, let's say, as the Commission has proposed, that also there would be a flow from member states programs into the transition. But that's, I would say, a bit, that is also depending on the negotiations of the member states with the Commission. If the budget is cut, I would expect the board to say, well, that maybe not something we can do. We could advise to do. What is also important is the balancing afterwards. So the STEP instrument has been new. The STEP instrument is relatively small, 300 million euros per year for, let's say, all beneficiaries. That is in US, even a small individual ticket. And in Dutch, STEP is a small bicycle. And the STEP we have had over the last 3 years is a bit like a small bicycle, and the one you can run on, but it's not a tank. So a serious STEP should have a bigger budget, but since the STEP works quite well, one can also expect a high leverage effect. And of course, there is a question. So the scale-up fund is now foreseen with a 1 billion EU budget and 4 billion private pension funds, investors, corporate investors. So what will be the balance there? Will there be again a dotation to a scale-up fund or not? That's something we have to learn also in the next year with, let's say, the initial start of the scale-up fund. Which, by the way, since we are in a Nordic context, is a very much Nordic support
approach.
Yeah. So the Swedes and the Danes are, I think, Denmark are the major investors, and
It is managed by a Swedish.
yeah, but
no?
they have offices in several countries.
Okay, so they're not real Sweden.
They're not really. No, let's say anyone who's successful in Europe is never a real national thing.
Okay.
Yeah, so equity is an important player
Yeah,
of European
course.
level as a whole. Yeah, so the scale-up fund is also an important element. But keep in mind, let's say the two important concepts of, let's say, more authority for program managers and what we call the fast lane, the ability to transit easier from one instrument to another. Then I think I will make that my last point is the connection to the ECF. If we look now at the reality, ECF instruments like the Connecting Europe facility or the Digital Europe project programs or LIFE. So the instruments that will be brought under the ECF grants are now important instruments to scale up companies. So we have a lot of beneficiaries that move from the EIC to what will become ECF instruments. So it's important that the transit is easy, also kind of fast lane, or at least that you don't have to put all your administered data again. So basically you can use the same portal. That would be a benefit. And of course, a single rulebook would be useful as well. So that's very positive. What is also very positive is to have a single rulebook for the debt instruments, the loan, the guarantee instruments managed by the EIB. That's also very good. What is more problematic is, let's say, the programming connection between the EIC and ECF. That's still a point that is unclear. And what is important to have in mind that the EIC is investing in a relatively early stage. So since the EIC is also going to do more defense-oriented dual use projects, imagine a pathfinder project on something dual use creates results that will be in the battlefield 20 years from now. If you take the pathfinder, if you take the accelerator, you're a bit closer to the market. You are, let's say, developing technology that will be in the battlefield around 2035, 33, 35. So if we get every year other priorities, yeah, that's fine. But every year a new priority has an impact 7 to 20 years later. So is it wise then to have annual changes? As I said, the best innovation policies are the ones that are relatively long-term and reliable. So that's an issue of interest. Keep also in mind that based on priorities, we select program managers. And program managers get, let's say, a multi-annual contract. So we cannot change every year program managers because there are new priorities. Unless we create a structure enabling that. But we think the program managers should have a relatively long tenure in order to be able to design challenges, to open the evaluation, to evaluate, to be in the selection process, and to see them starting and developing. So if you do only 2 or 3 years, well, you can just do one challenge and see the results of the evaluation. You will never see the implementation. Yeah. And what is also a consequence is that basically the program manager should be much more well developed into the structure. And currently we have 10 program managers, 1 head of unit, an assistant, and 3 trainees. Compared to the American ARPA approach, they have on average 7 people per program. Yeah. So that's something we will look at after the summer as well. I mean, the devil is in the detail. So how can we help the Commission of designing, let's say, a modernized agency that basically is able to do what is expected? I think I will leave the introduction to this.
That's very interesting. Thank you very much for this set of initial provocation points and also for designing the overall state of play, because of course things are still dynamic and so on. We are already receiving some requests to interact with you, but I take the privilege of being the moderator to challenge you with some initial questions. I listen with really interest the mention you are giving to the somehow multi-country dimension of the EIC. You spoke about scale up and widening, so the need to target some categories of countries that need to grow. You mentioned the fact that we are somehow inspired to some models like ARPA, which is a US model that looks to work for the specific purpose of the EIC mission. And you mentioned also another interesting part, which is the scale-up fund, that is complementing the final step to take the companies to maturity and being a solid actors in the market. There is a common element here, in my opinion, that I'm curious to understand how it's treated, because there is the international dimension, which is on one side the market of competitors, but on the other side another potential market for collaborations and investments. So what is the policy of the IC compared to the international market? Are we just trying to take the strategic autonomy of Europe by growing our own companies, or are we also working to a dialogue, maybe also to attract foreign investors in the scale-up fund, or developing joint actions with friendly countries, not necessarily based in Europe, and so on? So what is the international cooperation policy
I would say strategically, I leave that to the real politicians of having an opinion about that.
Yeah.
However, there are a number of operational questions. If I take it in circles, one thing I have not mentioned is that we have done an interesting instrument called a pre-accelerator that was basically to cover the difficulties of widening countries and accessing the IC. But what was interesting is that it also took into account the accession countries. And I was in Moldova the day that the results were announced, and Moldova had its first EIC beneficiary. That had a bigger impact in the press than basically the sum allocated. So we have a first range of countries that basically, so we have 27 plus 5 now. Basically, we see, let's say, a number of countries around Europe that we would like to consider as close to us. And we have been experimenting with this project called Seas of Bravery with Ukraine, and that Ukraine experience also creates a model of instruments that could work in other accession countries. That's one circle, but that makes Europe a bit bigger, but it doesn't change the real game, because the real game is Europe compared to the US and Europe compared to China. And there are a number of strategic issues. One of, let's say, an economic concept. So is the concept still based on we need to have our strong positions, but we also have to accept that we will have to work together with actors in those countries. So it's a relatively open and I would say negotiated concepts, so that we can warn sometimes countries that Nvidia is depending on Trump and Ganz Zeiss when it comes to technology. So basically there is a real dependency between countries, and also China is depending on European technology. So I would say personally it would be better to have a kind of acceptance of open strategic autonomy and stop being too, let's say, lethal here. The second thing is more operational. Do we accept, for example, that companies industrialize in China, the companies we fund? Or do we accept American capital?
That was the sense of my question.
Let's say what we see happening is a kind of a matrix with countries on technologies. So Russia is never no, never. And America and China, so China is very often no, and America is very often yes, and in limited cases no. Imagine in health technologies, it's too late. It's impossible to develop a startup scale-up landscape without accepting American investments. However, it should also help Europe to think about, well, why are so many investments going to America? Because they have a faster system of accepting innovations. So it should also be a lesson for us. How can we speed up innovation process and acceptance of innovation in the healthcare system in Europe? While still healthcare is not a European competence, it's still something of member states. So I would like to use the American and Chinese examples, or let's say cases, as we should not complain about it. We should learn from what is essential to do here in order to create that, let's say, a favorable demand context.
It's an interesting, challenging game as well in the context. That's clear. I don't want, of course, to take too much time out of the possibility for our audience to interact with you. We already have 10 possible questions, so I will start with Joseph Noll. Joseph, you have been the first one putting some provocations. I kindly ask you to open your camera and microphone and just challenge our guest. Please try to be short, as I know that you have many items.
Sure. No, I worked so much in the innovation sphere, and of course, one of the questions I have, two main questions. One is access to capital for the Valley of Death, and the second is we are looking a lot into big companies, not really looking into the potential of private households who, especially here in Norway, have quite some capital for like distributed energies and the future of storage and so on. Would you like to elaborate on those?
Well, in the context of the EIC, large companies are companies that are funded with tens of millions of euros. So it's not the big companies, the EIC, are not the Siemens and the Airbuses of this world. They are out of our scope. However, I often say I had recently an interesting example of a company coming to me. Yeah, we want to become leading in bio-based ingredients for cosmetics, and our business plan has 1 million euro turnover objective in 2030. Say, well, that's what my daughter, who is active in that sector, sells every day. So you need to have, if you want to have impact, you need to get to volumes. Otherwise, you don't have societal impact, and scale often is related to price. If you're too small scale, you're too expensive, and you're not accessible for households. What is interesting in your question is indeed the majority of companies we fund will grow through a B2B model. So they will grow by selling to other corporates, and these corporates will sell to consumers. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting to look also in the developing with, let's say, financial instance with the EIB, how can we promote companies also to develop consumer products that basically are sold directly to consumers? I think that's an important one. The second one, I take a bit as a sideway. The EIC is still dominantly based on a kind of model that companies develop something and companies exploit it, or they're taken over. While you might imagine, let's say, rare diseases, or let's say health data, which is it still should be in the public domain. So there's one experiment I'm following that quite closely, where basically a number of hospitals are preparing to set up a company as a joint pharmacy, let's say, for a number of hospitals to serve them. If they apply for the EIC, and if EIC funds them, that would be more kind of a cooperative in which it is invested. And basically, we will want to get our money back in some stage, but with a little other financial ambition than getting 3 times or 4 times the input. That's one. Where it's also interesting, I had a discussion in Croatia with a company, is when you move, for example, to plant-based proteins, you often need a factory that basically processes the beans close to the fields. So there's also a model where a corporation is set up of farmers. And there, the EIB funding can be important in funding the cooperative, and then the cooperative sells the extracted process to this company. And this company, by the way, sells to consumers. And so we also have to look at, let's say, alternative models of funding, which is not always, let's say, the hedge fund kind of approach to startups that is typically American.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your question, Joseph. The next one who asked to intervene is Vitor Bruno. Vitor, we are giving you the possibility to intervene. Just accept it and then present yourself and ask your question. Thank you. I think he's online.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. It's very cool to talk to you guys, to be present to the conversation. And my question is a more generic in a sense, because I understand that entrepreneurship, a lot of people think on deep techs and beyond. Sometimes we need to be more aware of possibilities that we can see, like smaller entrepreneurs, sole proprietorships, early stage startups. But I don't know how can we, sole proprietors, can help the ecosystem to grow. I mean, like we trying to engage with the market to show our opportunities, our strengths, but I don't see like us seen as founders in a sense. So my question is like, how can we help you to grow the ecosystem?
It's interesting. It brings about two questions. One is, I go back to the icing on the cake formula. What we see and say is that basically pre-seed funding and seed funding, also because of the subs and the cost of managing projects, regions or member states are more efficient in managing those kind of tickets than we are at a European level. So I think it would be unwise to have, let's say, a smaller ticket instrument at European level, unless to change. And the pre-accelerator is a small ticket instrument, but that's really to boost, let's say, development, but it's not necessarily designed as being a standing thing. The other thing, I had a recent interesting discussion. We don't fund edtech and fintech, for example, or prop tech, and even software as a service we no longer fund. And what I see is that while there is maybe no reason to do funding for them, the fact that we have, besides funding, also a whole range of services for our beneficiaries, and the EIT, because I saw a question on that, also has a whole range of services. The fact that you basically create an ecosystem for those industries is interesting without necessarily having a funding instrument. So, and I said when I met my commissioner, Zachariah, the first time, I said, well, please realize that the startup landscape is more than the 800 companies funded by the EIC. It's also the 10,000 not funded, and the 900,000 non-deep tech startups. And then maybe the European Commission does not need to develop systems or ecosystems or instruments for, let's say, garages, hairdressers, butchers, and consultants. But still, let's say, in some sectors, it's interesting to have, let's say, also an ecosystem approach.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vitor, for your question and participation. Next one is a friend and a former rector of NTNU and currently member of the board of the EIT, Anne Borg. We are giving you the possibility to connect, Anne. Very pleased to see you with us today. Can you open your camera and microphone?
Yes. So there we are. Thank you, and thank you very much for a very interesting introduction on the future and activities at EIC. As Massimo was saying, I'm currently a board member at the European Institute of Innovation and Technology, and that is also the background on my question. So I would like to ask you how you see the interaction, synergies and complementarities between EIC and EIT in Framework 10. That would be valuable to hear a little bit about.
An easy question.
As many people, I'm curious to know what will be the overall legal framework in the next FP10 on EIC and EIT. Of course, being president of the board of the EIC, I'm very anxious to know what the EIC position will be in the new one, and I have sufficient clarity on that. On the EIT, I'm thinking in the dark as you are. However, there are a number of elements important. One is that the KICs in the EIT have been important providers or preparers of applicants to the EIC. So there's a complementarity there that basically there's a plug-in or fast-track scheme with mixed successes. Some KICs are better than others, but basically there's an interaction there that is important to maintain. The second one, what is important is that if we imagine that by now with 11 billion euros, the EIC will have an ecosystem of around 1,600, 1,700 companies. That is tiny compared to any KIC. So the ecosystem of the EIC is much smaller than any of the KICs or the EIT as a whole, but the average ticket size is, of course, much larger. So the connection is much more intense in funding and in ecosystem support. So it looks like the same, but it isn't. It's a different Michelin stars. It's not a complaint, but if the EIC is moving to 5,000 beneficiaries, Yeah, we will not. It's not possible to cover all the services in that way. So basically, I see there a need to look better at the complementarity between the KICs and the EIC when it comes, let's say, to the ecosystem in which they work. And what is important is the KICs, basically, if they do well, and many do well, they have both startups, large companies, also public authorities. I think the climate KIC, which is an important one, and they also organize all these cities. So there's an important connection also of let's say, the ecosystem as a whole, in which the EIC is only one of the components. So I think I see strategically, let's say, and tactically, a number of benefits of having good connection between the two systems. And that's also the way the board will look at the future of the connection between the EIC and let's say what is under the umbrella of the EIT.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Next one is Craig Nicholson. Craig, you are going to be admitted. Please again introduce yourself before putting your question. There we are. Meanwhile, that Craig connects, I stole you 10 seconds. I see that people are raising the hand. Please do not raise the hand. Just write your name in the chat. Please, Craig. Sorry for interrupting you.
No, thank you very much. I'm a journalist with Research Professional News. I wanted to ask about dual use and defense. As of very recently, the EIC is allowed to fund dual use and defense, or at least, parts of the EIC when it comes to defense. And it looks like the same will be true for FP10. So I just wondered if you could say anything about what that requires you to do differently, or how operationally or conceptually, does anything change for you when dual use or defense are involved?
Yeah, there are three levels where it's relevant. The one was an annoying barrier that legally, if a project or a company of the EIC would have a dual use, we basically had to stop the funding. So imagine, I have always two examples. One example is a former assistant of mine. He set up a company developing a breast implant after cancer. And he discovered that the same biopolymeric structure can also be used very efficiently repairing wounds after grenades. Well, he started working with the French army, and technically the EIB could stop the funding because they work with the army. Oh. So one thing is to lift that, and imagine it's a wound system. It doesn't not even it's a human. It's not even a defense technology, but the client is the defense. So that was for us an important thing. We should lift that. And so basically, it's not because you're getting into dual use by coincidence and not by design that basically you should be stopped. A second encounter I had last week. I went to Eurosatory, the big trade fair of defense, and I found out that one of our beneficiaries is making a photonic chip, and a photonic chip ends up in a sensor in a helicopter, and the helicopter is used in a battlefield. That's basically what I would say, that is dual use by design. So that the system has been adjusted to a defense context. That is also worthwhile to lift because there's still civil use. So if you look at the current legal base as modified, is basically to enable that. You can have dual use, so you have a civil objective, but you might also have a military objective. Defense means basically to fund purely military projects. And then the question comes, what is it? We as a board have said it is wise to have that constrained in challenges, saying, okay, because if you have hodgepodge of innovations, you don't win wars by having a whole range of stuff. So you need to have a military strategy. You require technology, and that some technology is TRL 10, so that's out of range. Some is technology TRL 9, so that's also not needed. To be very fair, all the drone technology in Ukraine is TRL 9. It's modifying materials, changing the recipe for basically fitting in the system. We should basically stick to a system where we do early TRLs in Pathfinder, late TRLs 6 to 8 in the accelerator. And so we should stick to that model. And secondly, we should stick to a number of priorities. But I say also that to the policymakers, yeah, those priorities should be defined by policymakers, not by the EIC board. So that's and what we fear a bit is the EIC has also other strategic priorities like energy autonomy, food autonomy, materials. Defense may help, but we have also other things to set on Europe. So it also should remain predominantly a civil program.
Thank you.
Thank you, Craig, for being one of our faithful followers. We always appreciate to see you appearing on screen. So thank you for your question. While we open the microphone to Mike Nicolai, I think, I mean, there is an element that you touched upon that is interesting in any case to elaborate, because the EIC is a bottom-up instrument, no, in principle, more or less. But you are basically creating a top-down approach through the program managers and through a strategic approach to some specific thematic areas that you mentioned, no, like energy and so on. On the other side, you are somehow suffering the limited dimension of this system because you said we have 10 program managers and benefit for more. So do you expect, I mean, is it EIC freedom to increase the quantity of players, or is it also linked to the amount of funding that you're going to get, the possibility for the EIC to grow into its capability to impact on thematic-oriented innovation?
Well, the board, the EIC board made a statement in December 24, and we had done in 24 a whole work program of work in the board on what an APA approach is. And we came to the recommendation to the Commission to change the proportion bottom-up, top-down from 45% top-down, 55 bottom-up, to 55 top-down, 45 bottom-up. So it is still it is a blended instrument. But we would recommend to change the blend a bit to, let's say, a more programmed part. That also implies more program managers, by the way. But what we see is that, I also see that with the ERC, one can very well work with a substantial bottom-up approach, but it's very important to do an active harvesting of it. And I would also say to universities, I always say to universities, well, you have to organize within your university or your research organization also a harvesting process. So basically that with all your ERC grantees, you look whether there's a possibility of doing a proof of concept. And if you have a proof of concept to monitor them regularly, is it interesting to move to transition? And it's also interesting that universities do a regular analysis of their pathfinder portfolio to see whether out of that pathfinder portfolio, there's something of transition discovered. It's not a huge exercise. But I mean, to do every 6 months, the kind of, let's say, stock taking of progress would be something that the technology transfer unit should organize or a department should organize. Yeah. So the harvesting is a very important element. And I think that in general, universities should do more, and researchers should do more in having a very active harvesting policy.
I'm sorry to take the freedom for this because this is a topic that I was involved in my past life. I've been a technology transfer manager. I also noticed when you presented the fact that the transition instrument is somehow the bridge between other tools and the possibility to enter in the EIC pathway. And you mentioned Horizon projects, which basically I suspect you were referring to collaborative projects, but there you have sometimes an issue. The ownership of the deployed or developed technology is not necessarily of a single player, but more of a consortium-based agreement. No, you have the consortium agreement because the outcome of a collaborative project comes out of a collaboration. So how do you expect this to impact on the amount of possible transition projects coming from collaborative research? Because I think this could be a potential barrier for this to grow like other single owner technology beneficiaries.
Now, it depends whether I've been managing a Horizon project myself until 10 years ago. And what I saw is that sometimes you have, let's say, side products coming out of a Horizon project where basically the ownership is with 2 or 3 research centers and one of the SMEs. So it's not the main outcome of a project. It's a smaller one. Actually, The example of the breast implant was a side outcome of a composites project we were running. So, and Julien Payan set up a company around that side project. So that could be the case as well. The transition instrument is an instrument. It's a smaller consortium, so typically it's 3 to 5 partners. So it can be a smaller subset of a horizon project. And this, okay, let's go in this together, and then we will settle in a smaller part of the consortium, let's say the issues of IP. Okay. But then it should be, let's say, an IP which is not owned by all the 25 partners of a consortium, but by a subset of it. One of the things we are looking at as well is to be a bit sharper and saying, well, the transition instrument has a broader eligibility entry, but it can only be applied by a single company. So the company should exist, the legal base should exist, but then they could have we propose a more generous acceptance of subcontractors or affiliated partners. So then universities could be, let's say, not a voting partner of a consortium, but basically a supplying partner of a consortium.
Interesting. Meanwhile, Marike is with us. So Marike, sorry for keeping you waiting.
No problem.
You can introduce yourself. Yeah.
Yes. Hi, so my name is Marike Nicolai. I'm from KU Leuven. So thank you so much for sharing your insights this morning. And my question is actually related to what has just been mentioned. So we learned recently that the EIC transition might become a mono-beneficiary scheme in the next work program. So I was wondering if this is indeed the new direction for the FP10 for the EIC transition, and how do you view the role of the universities in this new scheme? Because you already mentioned that there might be more subcontractors involved, for instance, but if let's say the ownership of a certain result is with the university, then we would have to set up a spin-off, for example, or do a full transfer of this ownership of results in order to be involved in a new transition, or how do you see this in this new scheme?
Well, I'm still under shock of a visit to another Belgian university 3 years ago, where they were surprised that when in a Pathfinder project they need an exploitation plan. I said, well, it's an illegal base. And so let's be clear. Both transition and Pathfinder are not research funding projects. They are projects or programs to fund the emergence of a potential end use in Pathfinder and the emergence of a company in the transition. So we want to, for the board, we want to be very clear that the objective of the SC funding is not a small horizon project. No, the objective is to create companies. And we think that can be strengthened by having a much stronger impact paragraph and requirement in the Pathfinder. Remember, the Pathfinder has a tiny success rate, also because it's polluted by a lot of applicants who should not apply in the first place. And in transition, we see that mono-beneficiary projects lead to better startups than the multi-beneficiary ones. So behind the question of Marike, it's important to have in mind why the Pathfinder and transition has been imagined, because they are not, let's say, primarily university funding instruments. They are instruments to promote the emergence of startups out of universities. While Leuven does quite well, by the way. So
yes, that's true. It's true. Thank you.
Thank you, Marike, for being with us. We have unfortunately reached the end of this appointment. 1 hour with Europe is 1 hour. We still have 5 unanswered questions, and we apologize for not having had the time to take them.
I see that all of them are in my LinkedIn connection, so they can ask also bilateral.
Okay, you can write. I have the permission from Michiel to write him directly on LinkedIn and ask your questions to him. He is pleased to answer. Meanwhile, thank you very much, Michiel, for being with us for this 1 hour with Europe appointment. Yeah. I noticed that we got around 300 connected participants in the peak, so a lot of interest about the future of the IC, as you can see. To our audience, I would like to wish you excellent holidays, reminding to you that we are working for the September edition. We are probably going to have the Director General of DG Connect with us, and we are going probably to talk about the technology sovereignty, so it will be an interesting topic. The date will be communicated. We are negotiating, as you can imagine. It's not easy to find a common date, but stay tuned because we hope to announce this new appointment toward the end of August. And meanwhile, wishing you great holidays and thank you for attending to this 1 Hour with Europe webinar.